You think you can stand there and pretend you didn't know her? The woman across the ballroom shouted, all teeth and cheap perfume. And the words hit me like someone slamming a glass into my chest, while my daughter Lily looked up at me from the front table the way she always looks when she wants me to be bigger than my mistakes, people twisting, forks freezing half-air. Karen Mitchell's mouth falling open next to the stage where the promotion banner hung like a promise I'd spent 10 years building, and I could feel the heat of every pair of eyes turning, not at the upward arc of my career, but at the small private collapse I'd never planned to make public. My name is Daniel Reed. I'm 42, from Columbus, Ohio. I tell you that now because the room needs fax names to lurch against. While my hands are still remembering the shape of the coffee thermos I always took to the office, the one with the faded Bluebird Diner sticker that Sarah gave me the first week we moved, and which sat on the table beside my plate like an accusation. And there's a thing I keep that I never told them. A quiet advantage I've been tucking away in file folders and cloud backups for years: receipts, screenshots, GPS, breadcrumbs, small, boring acts of maintenance that look like cowardice until they become evidence. The woman Marta, with a voice like shattering glass and a laugh like a blade, kept on. You're a joke, Daniel. Do you want your daughter to see the man she thinks works for everyone else and not for the family? And the murmur beyond the chandelier swelled. Peter Lawson's face went white under the yellow light, and Sarah's hand flew to her mouth like she could hold the air in, and the world reduced to a bad angle photograph while my stomach did the thing it does when I'm about to make the work call that will change everything. It clenches. Precise, obedient. People stood up, some to leave, some to whisper, some to lean forward like it was a show they paid for. Lily's small hand tightened around her brownie's fork, and for a moment I thought I saw my old self, the man who would have run, who would have laughed it off and bought a new watch and pretended everything was fine, stand up and walk away. But there was a different kind of motion inside me, cold, methodical, the slow unlatching of the part of me that had always filed everything. Before we get deeper into this story, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from. The sentence sits there like a tab open in a browser, absurd, viral, and in the silence that followed, someone nearby snapped a picture with a phone, the screen flaring like a private sun and turning the scene into a thing that would not be mine to control. I felt the mug of my heart tip. The Bluebird sticker seemed to bruise with meaning because Sarah had used that thermos to warm coffee on midnights when Lily cried, and to hide the phone that would later buzz when Peter's name lit the screen. I remember thinking then, as forks clinked and the band's saxophone made a protest of being ignored, that pride is like a short coat. It looks fine until it's wet and you're cold. The band tried to play on some trumpeter with a mouthful of courage, but the music was thin, and I smelled the diner coffee on my sleeve and wanted to throw it away. People's whispers collected around the idea that I had been blind, that I had been foolish, that in the middle of climbing a ladder I had been too busy polishing my shoes to notice the rot in the rung beneath my foot. I sat very still. I felt Lily's gaze like an accusation and a shield. I could not let this be the memory she took away, not tonight when I'd promised her I'd finally get that promotion and fix the leak in the roof and stop working Saturday mornings. Marta kept talking about betrayal like she was giving me a verdict. And every direction of the room was Peter, his hand on the bar like a man trying to anchor himself to anything solid. And Sarah's face was a study in regret and calculation, the way someone wears an apology they aren't sure they mean. I remember the hiss of the coffee machine in my brain as if it were the judge. My palms were damp. I slipped the Bluebird thermos under the table where only I could find it, thumb tracing the faded bird like a rosary, and I started counting, not numbers, but things I had saved, small, legal anchors. An email thread where Peter had thanked Sarah for a good night. A bank transfer that matched a reservation at a motel. A screenshot of a map that showed their car near a roadside motel at 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, when Lily had been sick and I had been the one calling the pediatrician. A receipt I kept from a hardware store where I had bought a new crib hook and stored away the old in the garage because I do that, buy extra screws, log the purchase, tuck the receipt into a folder that says, home. The idea of all those receipts felt ridiculous in the grandeur of the banquet, until Marta raised her voice higher and Peter's laugh sounded like a bell gone wrong. I did not move to the microphone. I did not stand. The room wanted spectacle. I wanted the thing Marta had no eye for procedure. A cheap photographer at the corner of the room clicked more photos. A man with a fancy camera angled to catch the blush on Sarah's neck. Someone uploaded a picture within minutes, and the notification bloomed on people's phones like a white bruise. My hands had always been good at work, at spreadsheets, at fixing lawnmowers in the autumn, at changing a headlight quickly between meetings, but never were they so steady as when I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the folder labeled "If." The folder's name was a joke I had made at 30, a little dark humor about contingencies. It contained nothing poetic, only evidence, mundane and harsh, and I scrolled until I found what I needed. The text message where Peter had written, "Can't stop thinking about you" at 1:12 a.m. The GPS breadcrumb that proved 2 phones were in the same motel parking lot. A bank transfer screenshot with a memo line that read, "For tonight." My advantage was not a weapon, it was paperwork. In that instant, the crowd blurred as if someone had smeared water across a lens, and all I could see was Lily's face, the way she looked at me with a belief that the world was still fair if people told the truth. I felt something like anger, and something like grief, and something colder that I could not name. I closed the phone and put it back in my pocket. I understood the shape of what I had to do, exactly how to move without looking like I was moving, and the memory of 1,000 small receipts waiting in my house became the scaffolding of my plan. The first section of the plan was to make the humiliation not only public but undeniable. The second was to let procedure, not fury, be the executioner. I allowed myself one inner sentence, quiet and loud as a gunshot. Justice is not drama, it's detail. And then I let the world keep spinning around Marta's voice and the hum of the room as if I were listening to someone else's story until the right instant to open my hand came. People began to form clusters. Lily's eyes searched mine for the signal to flee or to stay. I tightened my jaw. Karen Mitchell whispered something to the company HR person. The word liability was like a blade. I slid my phone out again, thumb hovering over the screen, feeling like a man holding a lit match in a wine cellar. And when the band paused, I rose in the way you rise to the surface of a pool, slow, deliberate, pretending you'd been underwater on purpose. And I walked toward the stage, the Bluebird thermos steady in my hand like an intent, because there would be a time later to scream and break things, but tonight required a quieter demolition. My voice when I spoke into the microphone was not loud so much as clean. It cut through the chatter because everyone was waiting for spectacle, and I gave them sobriety instead. I said, I don't need proof on a silver platter, but I do have things people miss. Saved conversations, bank receipts, GPS logs, the little dull things that no one reads until they do. A rustle, a few huffs, a Vimeo of forwarded looks. I felt the heat of hatred from Peter like a living thing. He mouthed my name, Daniel, not as a statement but as a question. I let the camera find my hand and then my thermos, and I set the Bluebird mug down on the podium in a slow, deliberate movement, like a man making a claim on a table he paid for. There it would sit, banal and telling, as if to say, this is my ordinary life. This is the ordinary they broke. I left the microphone on the stand and walked back to Lily like I was returning from a battlefield and had an armful of flags. The LED screens around the hall flickered as someone, somewhere, decided to project a string of messages screenshots, crude and damning. A gasp moved through the room in the kind of wave that feels like someone getting the timing wrong at a concert. Lily's mouth opened, and she made a small sound I knew from when she was learning to speak, the sound of someone who trusted the adult to clear up the mess. I kept my face neutral. There's a moment before everything changes where the world seems to hold its breath. I learned to listen in that silence because it tells you where to step. And in that suspended second, my mind was not elsewhere, it was a map. The band's sax sat unused. The banquet plates still had coffee. Sarah's hand dropped from her mouth, and I saw Peter catch her wrist. The camera found that touch and magnified it, a looped accusation. People were already posting snaps, stories, the kind of half-baked justice that trades on immediacy so the damage to my image would ricochet. I needed to make it not just damage but consequence, not just rumor but a formal, procedural unraveling. If Marta wanted theater, I would give her a courtroom, but not the kind with robes and gavels, the kind with contracts and receipts you can point at. Pride is a short coat. Documentation is an anchor. I left the table and walked out into the cold night air behind the hotel. The city lights of Columbus smeared like a set of promises I'd once believed in, and I began to plan out loud in my head the sequence that would turn these screenshots into a machine that would grind Peter's career to dust and Sarah's social world into quiet. People say revenge softens with distance. I disagree. Distance clarifies. I walked the hotel curb with the Bluebird thermos under my arm, and the city air feeling like clean paper ready for a single, precise fold. My shoes squeaking on wet pavement, and the streetlight throwing a pale halo around the steam of my breath, as if to spotlight the fact that I was still breathing when everything else wanted to assume I'd stopped. My head was a room full of fluorescent lights, too bright, pointing at every angle where a lie could hide, and I moved through the light like a man trying not to cast too many shadows. Lily's small hand in the banquet room had been a compass, and now that compass ticked toward three things: clarity, consequence, and the cold arithmetic of contracts and procedure. I dialed Tony Alvarez first, because he'd been my bar friend for 15 years and because sometimes you need a man who will hand you a beer and a blunt assessment. Tony picked up on the second ring, voice thick with bourbon and a concern he didn't bother to hide. I said nothing at first, except the street outside the hotel and the sound of my breath, and then Peter's at the center, Sarah's at the periphery, and Marta lit the match, and Tony made a low sound that meant he'd read the whole room without seeing it and told me to come by O'Malley's in 10. I hung up and I thought about how evidence accumulates the way barnacles do, slow, ugly, and unnoticed until a hull scrapes the dock, and I felt the tug of a plan that would not be loud so much as inevitable. My first movement was practical. Get copies. I knew our company's HR portal like I knew the back roads of Columbus. I knew where Peter's email signatures lived, where his calendar entries hid, the way he labeled travel expenses, the ticks people carry into their digital lives. I opened my laptop in the car, bothered no one on the curb with the glow, and started to pull what I could. Public social posts already circulating, the photo someone had uploaded from the banquet with Peter's hand in frame, the screenshots Marta had thrown into the ring, all of it raw and messy. I saved everything in two formats, PDF and image, then duplicated it in a folder named Locked on an offline drive I carried in the glove compartment. I did not do anything dramatic on the phone. Theater belonged to Marta. My theater was silence and the slow clicking of transfer commands. The motel GPS stamp from the city parking cams and the bank transfer were trivial to find if you knew what to ask for, and I knew how to ask without sounding like a man hurrying to burn the world. When the bartender at O'Malley's poured me a beer, I answered Tony's questions in pieces so he'd have room to react rather than to tell me what I should feel. He had a way of boiling things down. You want them to pay, or you want them gone? And the answer lived somewhere between those two things like a splinter. I wanted them gone from the places that mattered to Lily, from the school plays, from the charity dinners, from the partner board meetings where her father's name was a brand. I wanted to recover the dignity that had been folded into a GIF and forwarded with mockery. People at the bar knew pieces of my face. They knew the lines around my eyes from late nights and office fluorescent light, but they didn't know the ledger sheet of private data I carried. It was a strange comfort. I met Marcus Hawley, the lawyer, 2 days later in a sterile conference room that smelled faintly of hand lotion and corporate coffee. Marcus had the kind of voice that makes you feel your decisions are legal before they're moral, and he listened like someone cataloging possibilities. I showed him the folder, the motel GPS snapshot, time-stamped bank transfers with memo fields that read like casual notes, the chat logs where Peter's language shifted from professional to intimate, and a curious detail that felt like a Hinge contractor invoice Sarah had signed that listed overnight accommodations as a line item under client entertainment, a billing category that, if audited, would be a stink bomb. Marcus sat back and picked at his glasses and said, "This is a mosaic, Daniel. Each tile is dull by itself. Put them together, right, and you don't need a torch. You need procedure." There was comfort in the word procedure because it meant there would be no yelling and no messy shoving matches. There would be rules, deadlines, forms with boxes, and that was where people like Peter fell apart under the weight of a form they'd not read. I left Marcus with a retainer and a list of things to demand: travel receipts from company cards, expense reports with itemized justifications, security camera footage from the hotel lobby, the company's policy on outside relationships, and disclosure. And most importantly, because law loves irony, the clause in Peter's contract about material misrepresentation that could void his bonus and tie his name to a legal liability if exploited with the right evidence. The legal hinge was small but sharp. It would not look like vengeance to an outside auditor, just a tidy application of policy. I began to think less like a wounded husband and more like a man assembling a case file. I stopped taking sleeping pills and started taking notes at odd hours. The newspaper clippings, the hotel receipt, the bank transfer, these were not trophies. They were tools. I called Karen Mitchell, because she had always been the one at company parties who kept an eye on the social dynamics, and I trusted that if anyone would confirm Peter's half-truths in a way HR respected, it would be Karen, though she had been whispering to her circle that Daniel needs to get with the program. She answered and said only, "Meet me at the West End Diner at 7. Bring coffee." I brought the Bluebird thermos, and the thermos-worn bird felt like a talisman. Karen's hands trembled for only a moment when I set it on the formica. She slid a napkin across the table and with it a note. Peter booked last week's client dinner under networking, but used the corporate card 3 times at 2 a.m. The word networking had a greasy feel. There is an ugly thrill to watching a plan come together out of tedium. The thrill of solving a crossword where every clue is a keystroke, and I felt almost clinical as I cross-checked emails to receipts. I began to stage leaks. I'd learned early in my career that information travels like water. It finds cracks, and then suddenly flows where you want it. I instructed Marcus to file a discreet HR complaint with attached documents. Not a screaming public indictment yet, but a formal paper trail that would trigger an internal review because corporations cannot ignore paperwork in the face of potential liability. The HR portal acknowledged receipt with a number. I printed the confirmation. Each confirmation was a pebble dropped into a pond, and the ripples were inevitable. My strategy included social exposure too, because Peter was a man who traded on appearances. If the board saw his name linked to material misrepresentation and unauthorized expenses, his promotion would wither long before any conversation about ethics concluded. I arranged for a trusted former colleague, Jenna, to accidentally find some forwardable content and make a quiet, anonymous tip to a blogger who specialized in corporate scandal. I am not proud of the small deceptions. I am proud of their effectiveness. The blogger's article would not need to point fingers. It would ask questions and leave the algorithm to do the rest. Watching the first tentative posts about executive scandal crawl across the social feeds was like setting tiny fires that singed, not burned, because my aim was to let procedure finish the job. But there were nights I sat alone in my garage under the dull glow of the porch light and felt the deeper thud of grief. The idea that I had trusted Sarah was not only personal but procedural. Trust is a currency you spend, and sometimes you cannot get banked again. I caught myself in the mirror once, a week into the plan, and for a half-second expected the face to betray some monstrous switch, then realized the face was just tired and determined, and that was enough. Revenge, I told the empty garage loud because the walls deserved to hear it, is a ledger, not a sermon. That was the line, my own motto, and it landed like a hammer blow in my chest. Precise and unpoetic, because in that sentence I admitted that what I wanted was calculation, not catharsis. I moved with an efficiency that surprised even me. Subpoenas requested through formal channels, copy requests for calendar metadata, a demand for CCTV from the hotel under security review, all the dull verbs of legal work, but the sum of them felt like power. Meanwhile, Peter started to look unglued. His posture in meetings drew tight at the shoulders, and he checked his phone more often, a man with a secret he could not air. Sarah's apologies arrived in bursts text messages that read like tax forms, bland and too late, and I saved them in a folder labeled Archive, because lawyers love context, and they will use the little tardy apologies as proof of awareness. Marta kept calling my name in the background of other people's conversations like a chorus, each repetition lightening her moral burden and loading mine. The real fun of watching the machine work was how ordinary it all felt. Filing forms, making calls at odd hours, driving to the municipal building to request parking records. The ordinary is a better disguise than drama. I fed a small packet of the most damning items to a journalist I knew through Tony, careful to withhold the legal hinges until HR had acknowledged the complaint. The journalist ran a measured piece about possible ethical lapses, and the company lawyers began to move with the cautious ferocity of men who smell risk. Peter called me one late night and left a message that sounded strangely like a man trying to compose an apology he had not yet practiced. I saved the voicemail and transcribed it because voices are evidence too, and because tone can undo a man in front of a jury of public opinion. Lily asked once why I was working on Saturdays, and I told her it was for the roof, which was not a lie. I was rebuilding something, though not the shingles. The Bluebird thermos kept my coffee warm and my hands occupied, and in the quiet moments I would rest my thumb against the faded bird and imagine the sound a heart makes when it stops trusting and starts calculating. There were nights when the plan felt like a living animal that needed feeding. A small anonymous post here, an email forwarded there, a subpoena quietly issued, each act tight and necessary. Yet the moral cost gnawed at me in little ways. Kindnesses unreturned, friends who needed me and could not find me because I was busy laying the rails of someone else's collapse. I told myself that some debts are social and some are legal, and I was serving both. The company's internal compliance officer, Ellen Price, called for an interview, and for the first time the corporate machine slowed to a cold, grinding thrum that felt like wheels aligning. I sat across from Ellen and I did not beg. I handed over documents in an orderly stack and watched her read, watched her eyes slide from the bank transfer to a calendar entry and then to the hotel receipt, noticed how the skin around her mouth tightened when she reached a line item that read, "Accommodation overnight." She asked one procedural question, and when she left, she carried with her the sort of expression people have when the weather is changing. No panic, only the recognition that storms need preparation. My plan, such as it was, began to look less like revenge and more like an audit, and that was the point. To let the machinery of policy do the unglamorous dismantling that spectacle could not accomplish. But procedure is patient and the public is impatient. The blog pieces stoked whispers and the HR complaint set a legal clock in motion, and those two hands moved together like gears toward a moment I had to time perfectly. There were small setbacks, and HR tech lost a file for a day. A journalist wanted more than I was willing to give, but I treated each setback like a misfiled receipt, annoying and fixable. All the while I was aware that the real test would be when I had to make the choice between exposing everything and giving the company the clean path to remove them quietly. I wanted punishment, not silence, because silence would let them keep the social circles and the respectability they had purchased with smiles. The thermos emptied one morning at dawn as I sat in my car outside the courthouse, keeping time by my breath when Ellen texted that the internal review would escalate to a board inquiry and that the legal department had recommended a temporary suspension for Peter pending investigation for material misrepresentation. I let the words sit in my chest like a coin in a slot machine waiting for the pull, and as my phone lost signal and the sun lifted hungrier over Columbus, I realized the next move would need to be cleaner and meaner, and that the quiet arithmetic of procedure would be enough to start the wheel turning toward them, but not complete the circle. And I returned the Bluebird thermos to the glove compartment because the next step required me to go back inside and begin the part of the plan that would not just startle, but finish. And as I walked toward the hotel door, my phone vibrated with a new message that would change everything, and I opened the message and the screen was a small, pulsing thing that demanded a choice. It was Peter, late and raw, asking if I'd seen what was being said, and then another line, "Call me." I looked at the timestamp, at the way his minutes bled into hours, and I understood that the moment to tighten the noose had arrived. I walked back into the hotel lobby with my shoulders set in a way that made the bellman glance twice. Bluebird thermos in hand like a prop for someone who had already rehearsed grief, and kept my face calm because calm reads as control, and control is how you make people show their insides. The board inquiry had been set in motion. The HR tech had become efficient when she realized legal was involved, and the social feeds were beginning to turn the banquet photo into a meme with a cruel, efficient humor. I let the meme circulate while the legal gears aligned because spectacle would do the bidding of public opinion while procedure dismantled the structure that allowed Peter his privileges. My first small surgical strike was to bait a response that would place Peter unmistakably in a position he could not argue with. I sent an innocuous work-sounding calendar invite from an email I created in the style of a vendor, using a name Jenna confirmed was plausible: Oak Ridge Catering, scheduling a client appreciation dinner at the exact motel and timestamp that matched the GPS breadcrumb I already had. I CC'd the company's travel coordinator out of habit so it would appear legitimate. I did not pretend to be anything I was not. I manufactured the context using the company's own naming habits and procedures because people sign scripted forms when the script looks right. Peter opened the invite and hit accept out of reflex, the little check mark on my phone glowing like a confession. Jenna sent a quiet, almost apologetic text, later saying she'd seen him accept it and that her stomach had dropped. I printed a copy of his acceptance and handed it to Marcus with a note. This ties motive to movement. Marcus smiled the way lawyers smile when contingency becomes proof. I felt nothing in that smile for a long time. Feeling was a luxury I had boxed into a file. The acceptance was a taut string. Pull it, and the rest followed. I moved through small administrative channels with a ferocity that felt foreign in my own hands. Formal requests for card transaction details, pressuring the travel coordinator for invoice numbers, a subpoena for the motel's ledger mundane, officious things that look like they are meant to suffocate. The motel ledger contained a client name that matched a corporate vendor line item Sarah had signed, and the ledger's signature looked like a rushed scrawl Peter used in travel authorizations. When I held that thin slip of paper in my fingers, the paper felt like possibility, crisp and decisive. The procedural trap hinged on one messy clause in Peter's contract that read, in bureaucratic legalese, employees must disclose any outside relationships that may affect their impartiality or the company's financial interests. It was a sentence no one read aloud at the holiday party, but it was there, and law likes to find the small bones in a flash of enthusiasm. I cross-referenced the ledger with the corporate card charges and discovered a set of transfers that, when itemized, had been coded under client entertainment but included lodging and seemingly personal charges. HR's eyes burned when I showed them the mix. Finance started requesting receipts and realigned categories like a cage being closed around a trapped animal. The company had a checklist for audits that Peter had never considered because he never feared paperwork, only consequence. I had built my entire approach around that arrogance. While paperwork worked slowly, I tightened the public rope. Jenna's accidental fine became a quiet tip to a columnist who covered corporate ethics, and within 48 hours, a tasteful but pointed column asked whether the firm's leadership had a blind spot for impropriety. The column did not name names, but it suggested patterns, and patterns are the currency of bad faith. Peter's name began to float near the edges of that conversation because people link reputations where gossip grows like lichen. Social pressure did the rest. Donors pulled back from events where his face might be in the program, partners whispered, and his calendar filled with avoidant meetings. I watched him in a board meeting as he tried to laugh through slides and failed. The corners of his mouth were brittle as a toast left too long in the toaster. Sarah called me one afternoon and sounded like she was trying to clean her throat of gravel. I listened while she made small attempts at apology and then suggested the kind of pragmatic steps people take when they want to minimize fallout-quiet separation, a pause, a leave of absence that reads like contrition. I kept her on speaker and transcribed the conversation because words are evidence and evidence has a weight that memory cannot match. Each time she tried to tell me that it had been complicated, I cataloged it. There is a slow terror when someone you loved becomes another kind of document, marked and filed. I did not turn my anger outward in a show of violence. Instead, I made a mockery of the one performance Peter loved, his polished LinkedIn profile. I reached back to an old vendor's email chain where Peter had casually bragged about closing a difficult account after a long night, and I took a screenshot, perfectly legal to capture because it had come into my inbox through normal channels. I fed a package to the journalist that included the motel ledger, the bank transfer, the calendar acceptance, and the screenshot with the line about closing accounts after long nights. The journalist ran a follow-up that connected the dots into a way that HR could no longer kiss away with a non-disclosure and a handshake. The story asked the company whether their expense policies had blind spots and demanded an audit. The piece added a social angle, a woman's perspective, quotes from employees about uncomfortable late-night meetings, and the online comments filled with the outraged and the sympathetic. Viral attention, when married to procedure, is a kind of justice that is methodical and loud at once. Peter began to stumble toward explanations that sounded like excuses, and the tone of his voice on recorded calls, one I had asked a friend to capture, sounded smaller than I remembered. He tried to apologize in emails that read like press releases, and they were saved too. Records make apologies into artifacts you can examine for sincerity, and they make insincerity look scripted. I set a trap that required Peter's natural impatience. A faux exit interview request that the company's HR placed on his calendar as a formality to discuss personal conduct. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of luring someone to a neutral clearing. I asked Marcus to be present as counsel and to advise HR to record the meeting because recorded admissions are tidy things. The meeting room was a gray rectangle that smelled faintly of disinfectant and corporate coffee pods. Peter arrived with the posture of a man who thought he could charm away discomfort. He admitted, in the recorded moment, to spending time with Sarah, but it was consensual and separate from work. He tried to frame the affair as personal and therefore irrelevant to the company, and in doing so, he stumbled into the clause in his contract about disclosure, which explicitly linked personal relationships affecting business conduct to material misrepresentation. His words under a recorder became the exact terms HR needed to escalate a formal breach. The recorder caught the casualness in his voice, the way he named dates and times without realizing that dates and times are the scaffolding auditors climb. You can't unring a bell, I thought as I listened to the playback later, but you can catalog when it rang and that catalog becomes the verdict. The line lodged in me like the hinge of a door that had finally swung. The immediate fallout was noisier than I expected. An internal memo announced an administrative leave for Peter pending investigation, and a terse public statement acknowledged that the company was reviewing internal compliance matters. The statement read like a bandage. It did not heal anything, but it began a process that could not be reversed with a smile. Peter's bonus was frozen under the material misrepresentation clause, a technicality that Marcus had flagged early and HR had been eager to use once they had the paperwork. I watched his network narrow as people who had once bought him drinks now declined invitations and gave one-word answers. Marta's name appeared in comment threads with speculation that amplified into ugliness. She bruised publicly as well, because gossip is a communal sport. I did not rejoice at Marta's hurt. I had targeted the system that allowed the betrayal, not the person's face. Yet the social cost was inevitable and messy, and it made me stomach-sick at odd hours. Sarah asked me once, in a late-night text that read more like a plea than a defense, whether I was going to destroy them. I typed for a long time and then sent only, "I'm going to make sure the things you asked me to believe are not lies on paper." She replied with a thread of ellipses and then silence. The legal wheels spun and produced subpoenas that pulled in phone records, and when we matched timestamps to GPS pings, the narrative collapsed into a single, damning line. Peter had used company resources to conceal a personal rendezvous, and Sarah had used company reimbursements to pay for accommodations. The audit found mismatches, client names that did not correspond to invoices, unitemized charges, and the kicker, a small HR form that required disclosure of outside relationships if they might influence vendor selection, that had a blank for Peter and a late entry from Sarah. The late entry was dated after one of the motel stays, and that little tardy box read like an admission. Finance issued a preliminary report that suggested potential recoupment of funds, and the word recoupment has a particular sound like something being taken back, like credit cards being reversed, like the polite face of punishment. There were nights when the moral arithmetic felt obscene. I had engineered public shame and procedural consequence, and now people I had known in other contexts were paying a price. Friends texted to say they felt sorry for my children, and sorry for me, and sorry about how industry gossip swallows lives. I answered in small practical sentences because practical things are less likely to open wounds. Pay the childcare, call the school, meet a financial planner. People who had once asked for my help in weekend projects called and offered condolences as if the world had folded over and revealed a new landscape. My hand shook once as I handed Lily a paper to sign for school pickup, and she traced the line where a parent's name should go and wrote mine in a clumsy scrawl, and then added a heart like she was an oracle of innocence. I kept my face intact for her because scars must be invisible to children if they are to remain soft. But there was a moment when the case file arrived in my inbox and the terms material misrepresentation and reimbursement fraud were in the same paragraph, and I felt an acid relief that tasted like someone finally turning the light on in a locked room. I knew, though, that the noose was not yet cinched. Legal processes take time and people can settle quietly, buy anonymity with non-disclosure agreements, and step back into society with pockets heavy and reputations merely whisper softened. I had to prevent that quiet escape because punishment through silence was not justice. The final move would require a public, irreversible exposure that would make it impossible for the company to sweep the matter under carpet without scrutiny. I began to plan that move with the same boring attention that had guided everything else. What would be the documentary evidence that could not be bought? What would be the procedural lever that made silence legally and socially costly? The answer came in two parts: First, a financial recoupment letter that would force the company to choose between quietly reimbursing or publicly documenting the wrongdoing. Second, a recorded deposition scheduled at the precise moment when the board would meet, so that the deposition could be leaked if the company considered a quiet settlement. I told Marcus I wanted the deposition to be public if they tried to hush it, and he nodded with a look that mixed professional restraint and private satisfaction. The plan needed one more thing: a human to open the final door. I thought of people who liked being part of history, and I thought of the journalist who had moved from curiosity to engaged investigation. I needed them aligned with procedure. I made a call that felt more like a prayer than a tactic, and asked the journalist to attend the deposition as an observer, and to promise on background that if there was a quiet settlement, she would write about the fact of the settlement and demand transparency. She agreed, nervous but hungry for the story. Everything smelled like rain and resolved paper when the day came. I checked my pockets for the Bluebird thermos and felt its familiar weight, and then left it in the car because some performances must be done without props. I walked into the glass building with my head low and my papers in order, and as I sat in the waiting room, I thought about what damage looks like when it's precise. Not a wrecked car, but a canceled contract, not a smashed window, but a frozen bonus. The machine I had built liked slow movement. I had to make patience do the work that fury could not. In the quiet before the deposition, I found myself thinking of Lily drawing on the back of a receipt and of the way childhood clings to small things. My phone buzzed with one new message from an unknown number. We need to talk. Tonight, 10 p.m. My chest gave a sound like something dropping into water, and I realized the next turn might not be procedural at all but personal, and that the line between the two had grown thin as paper and could tear with a single, and then my phone buzzed again with the unknown number. Tonight, 10 p.m. I read it twice because everything after the board memo felt like a negotiation between my plan and whatever human heat still clung to the people involved. And when I typed back, where? The reply was immediate. The old Bluebird. Come alone. The name hit like a cold wind because the Bluebird was not a place. It was the sticker on my thermos, the small ordinary things Sarah had given me, the ritual of diner coffee before early meetings. It was my life reduced to a symbol someone else could weaponize. I told no one and left Lily with a neighbor and drove the side roads so the GPS breadcrumb habit of mine would look like chance if anyone checked. The Bluebird Diner's neon was a soft halo against the rain, promising stale pie and cheap coffee and conversations you could not keep in a corporate portal. I walked inside with paperwork on my mind and the old habit of counting details. How many empty booths? Which waitress took my order? What angle the security camera faced? Because in a room like this, the difference between being trapped and staying free is what you notice. The waitress, June, nodded like someone who knows you by the rhythm of your breath and poured bitter coffee without asking. I set my thermos on the table, and its faded bird caught the neon light and looked ridiculous and sacred at the same time. The person at the far booth was already there, Peter, who had been undone by spreadsheets and calendars, and now sat like a man at the last stage before confession. Hands on the formica, eyes rimmed red and honest in a way I had not seen at the banquet. Sarah sat opposite him, thinner somehow, her hair pulled back like a bandage, and Marta's voice was gone. Marta had done her public work, and now the quiet, personal work remained. The unknown number had been Peter's. The message had said, "Talk. No attorneys." And there was a small, dangerous edge in a request like that because it promised intimacy, and intimacy is where men like us get lost. I did not come with anger to fling. I came with the calibrated calm of someone who had learned that a file is louder than a scream. Peter's face crumpled when he spoke first. "Daniel, I'm sorry. He used the old defense. The one men use when they think sincerity will paper over ledger lines. I cut him off with a slow movement and laid a printout on the table. The motel ledger, the calendar acceptance, the bank transfer, a screenshot of his careless bragging email. He looked at each piece as if they were sharp things laid on his skin. Sarah's voice was small. "We can explain, but explanations are soft and papers are not." I let silence do the heavy lifting while the coffee cooled. The diner had a camera near the register. I knew it because my habit was to notice angles. I asked June quietly if she ever kept tapes long. She said only for a week. By policy, she looked at me like anyone would when a file matters more than a face. I put my thermos in the middle of the table like a pivot and watched how the light hit the bird. It was absurd to feel the object as an accusation and as a talisman, but symbols hold a kind of truth that people do not always want to admit. Peter reached for his phone as if to call an attorney. I said, "Don't," and he froze because a recorded confession plus an attorney's argument is a different calculus. I wanted a human reckoning as much as a procedural one. I wanted him to face what his choices had cost in the small spaces of daily life. He talked, halting and raw, and admitted details in a way that sounded like he was cataloging them for a confession booth. His words were the kind an investigator would find useful later, but they were also unbearable in the heat of the diner where a child could have walked in and asked for pancakes. At one point he said, "We thought we were discreet," and I saw then the scale of his arrogance, the belief that paperwork could be outmaneuvered by silence. Marta had been loud and public. I wanted quiet and permanent. When Peter reached to explain the ledger entry as a mistaken vendor name, I slid across a copy of the company's policy on disclosures and circled the clause I had already used before. Employees must disclose outside relationships that may affect impartiality or the company's financial interests. He read it, and his face went from defiant to blank like a curtain pulled. I felt a small, fierce satisfaction that legal language dry, stupid, and impartial could be a scalpel. Marcus had told me a truth I did not want to hear. People like him trip on their forms. The Bluebird thermos, ridiculous and ordinary, felt like the last prop that mattered. I tipped it gently and the old coffee sloshed and left a ring on the laminate, a small, indelible stain. It matched the stain of what they had done, ordinary, small, and now undeniable. A small stain doesn't mean you leave the table, I told them, and they both flinched because the sentence was both literal and a kind of proverb. That was my single line of wisdom here. A ledger can make a liar into a monument stone by honest stone. The words landed like pebbles. I left the Bluebird with everything in place. The printouts, the knowledge that June would have a week of footage if anyone thought to ask, and the terrible humane clarity of watching two people realize they had not been thinking about the things that mattered to my child. The next moves were a squeeze. A public deposition scheduled for a board meeting that could not be postponed, and a light, targeted release to the journalist that made the press smell test the company using the precise facts we had. The journalist, true to her word, attended the deposition as an observer, and asked one pointed, open-ended question on the record that Peter answered in the same brittle way he had at the diner, unaware that an assistant had put a live transcription on a platform that auto-sensed to a reporter's feed. That live transcription looped into social feeds within minutes. A screenshot of Peter's answer. It was consensual and separate from work. Became the anchor for a thread that wove the motel receipts and bank transfers into one narrative. Digital exposure is a strange thing. It flattens nuance into headlines, but when nuance is false, it can be justice. I watched as the company's PR team tried to dampen the flames with statements about privacy and internal review, but the internet has a memory that corporations can't always sweet talk away. The screenshots multiplied, and the leaked chats one where Peter joked about smooth operations at 2 a.m. went viral on a loop. I had always known the internet would be an accomplice. It proved efficient and cruel in equal measure. The technicality Marcus had loved, the material misrepresentation clause, was ready to finish the work the PR statements had started. The board, having seen the ledger and the live transcribed deposition, voted to revoke Peter's promotion and to demand recoupment for improperly coded expenses. The clause that had read like a footnote in a contract became the thing that rescinded the bonus and opened the path for a civil claim. But it was not enough that Peter be punished by forfeiture. I wanted a double twist, a final turn that would make the moral ledger balance in a way that could not be paid off with an NDA. I had hidden one small piece until the end. A recorded chat between Sarah and Peter, wherein Sarah, in a moment of cold pragmatism, had suggested labeling accommodations as client entertainment, because no one audits the vendor names if the charges look businesslike. That recording had been gathered through a contact Marcus had arranged lawful discovery, but humiliatingly intimate, and it proved the intent behind the ledger. When the recording played at the deposition, the room inhaled. Sarah's face went white, and Peter's jaw opened like a man who had seen a trap he had himself set. The duality of their involvement, Peter the actor, Sarah, the facilitator, shifted the narrative in a way that made the company unable to simply depose Peter and wash hands. The legal team recommended a public recoupment and an external audit. Marcus recommended civil proceedings for embezzlement of corporate funds through mischaracterized expenses. The kicker, the poetic justice came when the audit uncovered a detail no one thought to check. An internal vendor list that showed Marta's brother's catering company had been paid for other client entertainment events, while Marta had been on a committee that recommended vendors. It turned out Marta had been part of a network that profited from opaque reimbursements. The public's appetite for scandal takes strange, satisfying turns. People who had attacked me for exposing a betrayal suddenly saw a pattern that implicated more than individuals, they saw systems. The social tide shifted and the narrative expanded from a love triangle to a culture problem. The comment sections filled with demands for oversight and for the company to reform its expense policies. Procedural justice, once set in motion, had a way of uncovering other small legal knots. Contract clauses found other clauses and they unrolled into a net. The company resigned its head of procurement. Marta's brother faced review, and Peter's name, once a brand at cocktail parties, was now a footnote in policy memos scanned by compliance officers across the industry. I had wanted a reckoning, not spectacle. The machine of paperwork and public pressure had given me both. When it was over, when the board issued a final statement that included recoupment and reform, and when Ellen Price called to say the audit recommended new vendors be vetted publicly, I felt the relief as a physiological thing that was not joy so much as the easing of a muscle you have held cooked for months. People called me hero and villain in equal measure. Neighbors offered casseroles and old friends offered tips on how to get through a divorce. I did not answer them all. There was a cost. Loss of trust in a marriage that had been brittle for a while, a friend group that had fractured, and the heavy knowledge that what I had done was to make private failures public in order to prevent private impunity. I thought of Lily and how her face had been the compass all along. She sat with me at the kitchen table the night after the final statement and traced the bluebird sticker on my thermos with a small finger, as if rediscovering a relic. I told her, simply, that grown-ups sometimes have to fix things by using rules because people will not always do the right thing without them. She nodded and turned the thermos between her palms. At the end, there was one small, human irony. The company required an exit interview with Peter to document the recoupment, and in that exit interview he signed a line that, by contract, forfeited any pending bonuses, and acknowledged the misrepresentation. He had signed exactly where the policy asked employees to disclose influences. In his hurry and arrogance, he'd left a literal signature that closed the loop. It was a clerical moment that felt like theater a man undone by the very boxes he thought were irrelevant. The procedural finish had a merciless neatness, a signature, a clause, a public memo, and a viral thread that would not be deleted. The double twist was that Marta's loud reveal had started a justice process that ended up pulling threads that implicated a wider web, and that Peter's own casual acceptance of a calendar invite, a reflexive little checkmark, had sealed the timeline like a thumbprint. In the end, the betrayer was not only publicly shamed but legally and financially unmade. The system he'd gamed used its own rules to unmake him. I walked away with paperwork in a folder and scratches on my heart that would not be healed by audits. I had wanted to protect my daughter and to make right what they had made wrong, and I had done it with ledger lines and a journalist's courage and the petty dignity of a man who kept receipts. Truth is a file you can open and shut, I thought, and the thought was as steady as a metronome. I returned the bluebird thermos to the shelf in my garage where it had always been, its faded bird a quiet monument. The lesson was plain. Keep your records and your children will have someone to vouch for them. The cost of clarity is high, but living in truth is cheaper than living in a lie. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. It helps us share more true stories like this.